Elsewhere, heavy lake effect snow was expected through today in parts of Michigan. Meanwhile, dangerous cold enveloped parts of the upper Midwest. Moving on to the economy, inflation ticked up in November, being driven by shelter and food costs. The U.S. annual inflation rate rose for the second month in a row. It's now at 2.7%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's 0.1% higher than in October. To discuss this, we speak to Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayers Union. Good morning to you, Pete. So what does that 2.7% inflation rate mean for the average American? How expensive have food and housing become?
Well, this report is cause for some concern, but not alarm. We should sound the alarm if we have a third report in a row, the December report that comes out in early January, showing another increase. If that happens, the Federal Reserve may decide to pause interest rate cuts. It will probably cut interest rates next week. That seems prudent. Average Americans right now are worrying about how food costs, such as the price of eggs, which has risen about 100% since the beginning of the pandemic, will continue affecting them. That's a problem for the average person at the grocery store when you consider that 1 out of every 4 households in America have less than $1,000 of savings in the bank. So, when eggs go up to $4, even $5 a dozen, and your grocery bill is $20, $30 higher a week, when you have that small of a savings cushion, you start to worry about whether you can put food on the table for your family. And so that's something politicians don't seem to understand here in Washington. A few dollars can really add up.
Well, and policymakers are frustrated about this persistent, stubborn inflation, saying that the frequency of the rate cuts may need to drop if they don't see some more progress on this. But now, why are these shelter and food costs so high right now? What can be done about it?
One reason that shelter costs continue to be high is the renegotiation of rental leases. That tends to happen at the end of calendar years, but we're not going to know whether rents will go significantly lower. The upward pressures, well, you've got the cost of building supplies. You have regulatory costs. It is very expensive to put up a new housing development owing to all kinds of local zoning ordinances. You also have the threat of higher property taxes as local governments being weaned off federal aid are trying to find new ways to raise revenues. Those could make shelter inflation a persistent problem over the next several months. For food prices, well, government intervention there is also a problem. Price supports, many kinds of artificial subsidies for crops that keep prices high rather than letting markets set prices. That is a problem. And of course, down the line, we may have the threat of costly tariffs. Now, tariffs are nothing more than import taxes that hit U.S. consumers. If those go into effect, and the Trump administration has threatened that early next year, we could see a massive surge in inflation. So politicians cannot take these kinds of inflation reports lightly. They need to contribute to policy solutions that make sure we stay on the right track.
Well, one of the members of the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve said that the job market's strong, labor market is strong right now, and inflation seems to be approaching that Fed 2% benchmark, even though there may have been some bumps along the way. But where is inflation heading off of its peak following the pandemic? Is there any good news, and what could that mean for the possible rate cut?
Well, some of the good news is in the energy sector. Energy inflation seems to be well tamed. In fact, the promise of more permitting on federal lands for oil and gas, less restrictive policies toward exploration on non-federal lands, that seems to portend that we're going to have continued drops in energy costs. That will help to take the edge off some of the other parts of inflation in shelter and food, especially since the incoming Trump administration is saying the old drill, baby, drill mantra. If that continues to occur, I think we'll see lower prices at the gas pump, lower prices for heating. That will help consumers.
So give us an overview of the economy that we're looking at right here as we change administrations.
I think we need to remember that inflation can always rear its ugly head if the Federal Reserve and politicians in Congress and the White House allow it to happen. That's how it got out of control under the Biden administration. The Trump administration cannot make those mistakes. It has to avoid tariffs. It needs to make sure that tax cuts are extended so businesses have certainty, needs to work on regulatory reform to get those costs down of providing shelter.
And just in a minute here, Pete, are we headed toward a soft landing? Is that possible?
A soft landing is still possible, but only if public officials realize they have to play a role. Sometimes keeping their hands off the market economy, other times enacting positive reforms that will make sure consumers are protected from high prices. A lot is in their hands. They can't blow it now.
Thank you for this very valuable insight. Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union.
My pleasure.